strange grinding noise echoed around her, the ground beneath her body beginning to shake. She could hear, feel. She was awake, alive. Terrified of what she may see, yet compelled by curiosity, she opened her eyes, slowly at first, until she realized she was surrounded by darkness. Where was she? How long had it been? The last thing Anna Coleridge remembered was planning her own burial, wanting to make sure no one would disturb her in her quest for eternal peace. The location of her grave had been specifically chosen, placed far enough away from the village and completely unmarked so as to evade the crafty grave robbers. Nothing was sacred. Wedding rings, brooches and medals were all just prizes for the first person to be able to dig their way into a grave, disregarding the corpse inside the casket just to make a little money on the black market. It was desecration of the worst kind. All too often on the walk through the local graveyard, a shortcut when taking her children to school, she had seen the graves of friends and family members clearly disturbed if not completely reopened. No one ever really knew who the culprits were, but they had to live in the village themselves. Outsiders couldn't descend upon the graves with such regularity or speed. The unknown disease had hit suddenly. The village doctor didn't know what it was. No one knew where it had come from. But regardless, the villagers were falling ill, not just the elderly and children like with most diseases of the time, but healthy men and women as well, slowly withering until they were a frail shell of their former selves, death not far away. The only road through the village was a thin dirt track. Deliveries, sent sparingly from the local town, were made by horse and cart. The villagers preferred to grow their own crops and raise their own cattle. Depending on the outsiders, could prove very costly in times of war or widespread disease. But certain things were beyond the capability of the villagers, and they relied on the packages from the town to help them survive. Only now, one of those deliveries was almost certainly the cause of their demise. Fearing the worst, Anna dug into the bottom of a chest containing heirlooms left to her by the previous generations of women in her family. Blankets, recipes, wedding dresses, all meaning something in the family timeline. But it was a book that was the object of her desire. This particular book, left by her great-grandmother, contained various spells and rituals, mostly thought of as superstition, but in her great-grandmother's time they had almost been considered gospel. As a teenager, Anna had read through the book, wanting to see what kind of spells she could cast, but nothing ever took her fancy, not that she believed they would ever work anyway. With death approaching fast, she read the book again, settling on one spell that could prove to be her salvation. The spell was to be carried out before burial by the soon-to-be deceased. With the right ingredients collected from the nearby countryside, and the chanting of a specific verse, it was said that once dead and buried, should a body be disturbed from its eternal rest, whoever was responsible for the disturbance would be cursed, and would either die or be driven to madness. The legend regarding the spell told the story of Elizabeth Barrington, a woman in her early 30s who, upon learning there was no cure for her illness, arranged the digging of her own grave, where she then carried out the ritual before her death. When she died, she was buried in the local cemetery, within walking distance of her own home, thinking it would be safe under the watchful eye of her family. Upon her death, the vicar and family members who gathered around her grave said their prayers, hoping she would rest in peace. She wouldn't. The night after Elizabeth's burial, a grave robber descended on her grave, a shovel in one hand, a lantern in the other. Briefly looking around to make sure he was alone, the grave robber began to dig, breaking through the freshly turned up soil with ease. He was fueled by adrenaline, loving the feeling of digging for treasure, knowing that at any moment he could be caught. The desire to claim his prize, mixed with the nerves of being discovered, caused him to dig faster. Before long he reached the coffin, pulling the lantern down into the hole. Using the edge of the shovel, he drove the metal into the wood, conscious of the noise he was making, pausing only for a brief moment before continuing until he could break open the lid, allowing him to peer inside. He had found his treasure. A gold locket hung around Elizabeth's neck. Taking the locket into his hand, he quickly admired it before ripping it from the corpse, not caring about breaking the clasp. But the real prize was on Elizabeth's fingers. As hoped, she had been buried wearing her wedding rings. One ring was a plain gold band, the other contained a large diamond, glistening in the lantern light, inviting the robber to touch it. Pushing the lid completely from the coffin, the robber kneeled down, placing his legs either side of Elizabeth's corpse, hoping it would give him the leverage needed to pry the rings from the dead woman's fingers. His breathing was erratic, a smile etched on his face, drawing pleasure from the experience. Lifting the cold, limp palm of the corpse, feeling the contrasting temperature against his own skin, which was warm and beginning to sweat, the robber pulled at the rings, but they didn't move. He gave them a second tug. A sound, like a groan, outside the grave caused the robber to panic. His heart pounded, his resolve breaking as he decided his only option was to cut off the dead woman's fingers. He could pry the rings free later. To be caught now after dozens of successful robberies was to lose his livelihood and no doubt be sent to prison, or even worse, executed. It was too much of a risk. Reaching into an inside pocket in his jacket, he produced a knife, hesitating only for a second, his hands trembling, before making the incision just below the knuckle. He gasped in shock as blood began to pour from the wound. Another groan echoed into the night, but this time it was from inside the grave. Elizabeth began to stir as the robber kneeled, quaking over her body, unable to move until Elizabeth sat up, coming face to face with the robber, glaring deep into his eyes. From somewhere deep inside, the robber found the strength to move, his terror fueling his actions. Scrambling to his feet clumsily, he jumped out of the grave, but as he did so, he caught the lantern with his heel, knocking it over. The light went out. Cowering behind a nearby tombstone, his teeth chattering, he heard Elizabeth groan as she rose from the grave, pulling herself up out of the hole. Her footsteps came toward him, making him quiver against the cold marble he held with one hand, his knife still clutched in the other. He was ready to strike if the need arose. She was already dead. No one would blame him. As Elizabeth walked by, she noticed the robber and turned toward him. "And who might you be?" she asked, her voice inquisitive. Hearing the corpse talk made the robber leap into action, running away from the woman he had just uncovered. Elizabeth just shrugged, continuing on her way out of the graveyard. The robber, fleeing from the corpse in the darkness, his legs almost buckling beneath him, ran straight toward the open grave. Plummeting down into the ground, he landed on his own knife, puncturing his stomach. The heat was searing as the metal sliced through his flesh. With one hand he tried to pull the knife from his body, but the pain caused tears to flow from his eyes, biting his lip being the only thing he could do to suppress the cries of agony clogging up in his throat. Even if he got someone's attention, how likely were they to help him? He was a robber after all. He tried to pull himself up, but he was too weak. Wheezing and gasping for air, he collapsed back to the ground, unable to move, all strength having left his body. The robber bled to death in the grave that he had dug for himself. When morning came, Elizabeth's husband returned to visit his wife's grave, only to find the robber lying in the coffin instead. No one ever found Elizabeth's body. Fearing that she would not be granted entry to the afterlife should her body be dug from her grave like the legend of Elizabeth, Anna gave the strict instructions on where she was to be buried, that she was to be buried with no earthly possessions, and as an extra precaution, she gathered the needed ingredients to perform the ritual, praying for peace in the afterlife. Death had taken her less than a month later, her body almost paralyzed, covered in sweat yet constantly shivering, until it finally went rigid as her life drained away. But something had awakened her now. The ritual had worked. She had died. She had been buried. Now she was alive again, laying in her coffin, and someone had disturbed her and invaded her resting place. Now they would pay for their sins.